In part 4 of getting information from graphs, we are going to look at two functions, and we're going to compare those two functions to determine which function is greater. So we have two functions, f and g. F is kind of this burgundy color, and g is blue on the graph. And we need to find out which is smaller, f of 6 or g of 6. What that means is we're going to look at an input value of 6. So I'm going to find that input value on the x-axis. So here is 6. If I trace 6 up to the f function, I'm at approximately 3.5. So if I say f of 6 equals 3.5, that represents the value or range value for an input of 6. If I look at g of 6, I have to trace my input of 6 up to the blue function, which is at approximately 5.5, maybe slightly higher. That tells me that g of 6 is approximately 5.5. Therefore, f of 6 and g of 6 have a relationship. Since my range value for f of 6 is less than the range value for g of 6, we can put an inequality between them and say f of 6 is less than g of 6. Now we need to look at f of 3 and g of 3 and determine which is larger. I'm going to find my input of 3, and I'm going to trace my domain value up to the function g and also up to the function f. So this f of 3 will be almost 6. So let's say 5.8. G of 3 is right at about 3. So we could say that f of 3 is greater than g of 3. We now need to find the values of x for which f of x equals g of x. All this is saying is, where do the functions overlap each other? You could also say cross. If I highlight those values, they cross at 2, 4, the point 2, 4, and 5, 5. And also, this one's a little more approximate, 7, 3.2. So I will list those points out. The x value for the first intersection is at 2. The second intersection is when x equals 5. And the third intersection is when x equals 7. We need to find the values of x for which f of x is less than or equal to g of x. Now there's a pretty quick and easy way to determine this. Whenever f of x is below g of x, then we know that the function is less than or equal to g of x. So if I look at my intervals, wherever f of x is lower, the burgundy line is lower than the blue line, we know that is an interval where the function f of x is less than or equal to g of x. So I will highlight those intervals. The function f of x is lower than g of x from 1 to 2. The function f of x is higher than g of x on the interval from 2 to 5. So we throw that one out. The function f of x is less than g of x on the interval from 5 to 7. And on the interval from 7 to 8, f is greater than it, so we will not include that one either. That means the interval for which f of x is less than or equal to g of x is on the interval from 1 to 2. Notice I can include the endpoints because of the less than or equal to there. And also on the interval from 5 to 7. We need to find the value of x for which f of x is greater than g of x. So this is everything that's left. And notice we do not include the endpoints. So everything that's left is the interval from 2 to 5 and from 7 to 8. So the values of x for which f of x is greater than g of x is on the interval from open parenthesis 2 to 5, close parenthesis, union 7, open parenthesis 7, to 8, close parenthesis.